Warren Sharp from sharpfootballanalysis.com, also Sports Grid and The Ringer, and had a great article, deep dive on what's going on with scoring in the NFL. I was surprised at this, Warren, that it's right in front of us, but maybe we're not noticing. What's the issue with scoring and why is it down in the NFL?
It's made the games a little bit more difficult to watch. It definitely feels different than prior years. And that's, your eyes aren't deceiving you. In 2020, 2021, 2 years ago, we were seeing over 500 touchdowns scored throughout the league by this point in the season. We haven't even eclipsed 397 this year, not even 400. And this has been the lowest average total score between both teams combined since before we had passing rules changes in the 2010 season, where they started protecting quarterbacks more, started protecting receivers going over the middle, tried to start reducing concussions. From that point onward, we saw more passing. Passing leads to bigger gains. Bigger gains leads to quicker drives down the field. And we saw scoring increase, and it continued to do that. We saw records being set, Dan, all these quarterbacks breaking this record, breaking that record. And the league loved that kind of stuff. The league loved higher scoring and more points and more touchdowns. This year, all of that's massively reverted. And the most interesting thing in terms of how do we scale this? How do we explain this in a way that a lot of people could understand would be that odds makers in the betting markets try to set the combined total score between both teams. They try to set the total, is what it's called, on the game. And this year, that total that they have set, they have seen the regression in these offenses. They've seen the lack of scoring. They have set that average combined point total between both of the teams at only 44.1 points. That's the lowest projected total since 2011. So they're saying, we don't think you guys can even meet levels a couple of years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, back to 2011. That's all you guys are capable of doing. And despite the fact that total is set so low, we are seeing average total games go under at a 61.5% clip, which is the lowest we have seen, or the highest rate of unders we have seen since 1991. So they're like, we have low expectations. You guys can't score points. And we are continuing to see games go under at the highest rate. And so it's a problem. Defensive have made changes. Offenses have made adjustments, and they're not doing them quickly enough. And the league itself is calling penalties in a way that they haven't been before. And all three of those elements are contributing to these low totals.
Okay, how alarming should this be for the NFL home office?
Well, I think in an era that they're trying to grow the league, they're trying to spread the game internationally. A lot of the focus has been on these touchdowns for fantasy football, and that certainly has helped grow the league. Sports betting is getting legalized. And here's one element that I don't think a lot of people are discussing. I didn't hit on this in the article, Dan, but I do think it's a small factor here. Think about this. When you have games that only see, let's use just an idea. Let's pretend you have only 2 touchdowns and a couple of field goals scored in a game. If you have one bad call from a referee that then results in a team getting first and goal on a pass interference call, and they score a touchdown to give that team a second touchdown, the third touchdown of the game, that touchdown might have a massive weight on the outcome of the game. Whereas if there's 6 or 7 touchdowns being scored in a game, one factors in a lot less. And so these bad calls that some of the refs are having, they get magnified a ton now because point totals are down. So the league may not come out and say, well, this is a problem, but I do think behind the scenes that they probably aren't very excited about the direction of offenses and defenses catching up to them. And they would like to see more touchdowns being scored. They would not like to see the focus being on their officials as much as it currently is right now.
But so what are defenses doing differently?
So they're playing a lot more zone defense, which means they're sitting back, which means offenses then, they can't throw the ball as deep down the field. So offenses have said, we need to matriculate the ball down the field a little bit more. We need to throw the ball shorter. And we've seen that the average target of depth, the distance that quarterbacks are throwing the ball on average, has decreased over the last few years. Ordinarily, you say, okay, we'll build around that. We'll figure out a way to still matriculate the ball down the field with these shorter passes, because shorter passes should be easier to complete than a deeper pass. But the reality is offenses haven't taken that next step. And we are seeing completion rates that are at or worse than what we've seen when teams were throwing the ball deeper down the field. So while defenses are playing more zone, completion rates have also fallen off, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And the onus then is on the offensive staff and coaches to figure out a way to increase the completion rate because the passes are being thrown shorter. In addition, we are seeing something else that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and that is a higher sack rate. We are seeing sacks at a 7.1% clip, the highest that we've seen in the history of the True Media database, which goes all the way back to 2000. But we are seeing teams blitz less frequently. Defenses are sitting back in zone and they aren't sending blitzes as much. So how are we getting sacked more when teams are blitzing less? That also doesn't make a lot of sense as to why that should be occurring. And part of it, I think, is the way that the league is officiating penalties of late over the last year or two has definitely helped defensive lines. And we can dive in a little bit deeper there if you want, but that's a couple of things that defenses are doing differently that offenses have yet to adjust quickly enough to help them move the ball down the field a little bit more efficiently.
And it feels like at least through the first, month and a half, the officials are letting the linemen line up a little bit further back, almost to say, you guys need a little bit of help against these edge rushers. You would think that would negate maybe, that advantage the edge rusher might have and help these offenses. If the NFL asked you for a rule change to help with more scoring, what would you say?
Well, first of all, they have, I think you're talking about how the tackles are allowed to sit back a little bit more, especially in the spotlight has been the Kansas City Chiefs tackle. Yeah. But what they've been doing over the last year is they've been false start penalties by offensive linemen are on the rise, actually. And defensive line penalties, such as offsides and neutral zone infractions, are decreasing. And so it's giving the benefit of the doubt to defensive lines to get some of that pressure on quarterbacks, on offensive lines. We're also seeing just worse offensive line play around the NFL to some extent, and that's allowing these quarterbacks to get sacked a little bit more. One of the penalty emphasis that they introduced that I would like to get out of the league a little bit more is the ineligible man downfield. Now, they never officially came out, in the offseason. They usually say, okay, we're going to emphasize these rules a little bit more. They didn't do that, nor did they change the rules. But just like 3, 4, 5 years ago, we were seeing ineligible man downfield penalties. We were only seeing about 4 to 5 of those called through week 6, which is where we are at in the season. In total, like less than 1 per week, ineligible man downfield penalties. Last year through week 6, we saw 39, and this year we saw 24, over 5 times more. Wow. And what they tried to do is introduce these ineligible man downfield penalties to take away the advantage of these run pass options. The quarterbacks would stick the ball into the running back's belly, pull it out, and throw the ball. Offensive linemen might slip a little bit downfield to help block on these pass plays. They wanted to get that out of the game. But what we are seeing instead is that they're calling and flagging these offensive linemen for drifting even a yard or two beyond this imaginary line. And it's negating like 30 to 40 yard gains by offenses on just deep passes down the field that don't have anything to do with run pass option plays. They're just being very meticulous about trying to call these types of penalties. And I think that penalty going lower back to what we were seeing previously would not negate some of those penalties. And the other thing that we are seeing is, defensive cornerbacks and secondary players in general, safeties, are getting away with a little bit more grabbing and tugging. The refs are trying to reduce overall penalties. They're trying to reduce the amount of defensive pass interference calls, but it's definitely hurting the product. We aren't seeing quite as many big explosive plays. And the only way you're going to get big explosive plays if you get some of these receivers a little bit more open down the field. And so if the NFL wants to increase scoring a little bit faster, they could allow for bigger explosive plays. And the only way you can do that is to reduce some of that. They've reverted from what they've done a few years ago. Previously, they were calling defensive pass interference clean. But now what they've tried to do is reduce the amount of defensive pass interference, which are spot fouls, and instead call illegal contact or defensive holding, which are only 5-yard penalties. They give the offense a first down, but they don't give the offense the 20 or 30 or 40-yard gains down the field. So defensive backs are grabbing and tugging a lot more, knowing it's just a 5-yard penalty that they might get, as opposed to giving up, a 30 or 40-yard gain. And so it's to their advantage to do that. They've adjusted themselves and they're coaching to grab a little bit more down the field. And here's one other stat on that same element. We are only seeing 48.3% of drives either reach the red zone or score touchdowns before then. That's the lowest rate we've seen since 2000. So teams aren't even getting into the red zone. Offenses aren't figuring out ways to get down the field. It's in large part because this explosive play rate is down so much.
Great stuff. Thank you, Warren. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That's Warren Sharp from sharpfootballanalysis.com, Sports Grid, and The Ringer.